Did you hear what Sheila's son did? Married that girl from nowhere. No family connections, no money, nothing to bring to the table. I don't even know what Marcus was thinking. Joanna heard those words the moment she stepped through the side gate of the community garden on a Saturday morning in late October. Her mother-in-law's voice carried sharp and clear through the cedar fence, loud enough to stop her cold on the stone path, with a canvas bag of seedlings still in her hand. She recognized every voice in that circle. Sheila, her mother-in-law, was holding court the way she always did at the neighborhood garden committee, surrounded by 3 women who had known each other since their children were in elementary school. Joanna had met them all at the Thanksgiving dinner 2 weeks ago. She had brought homemade pearages and a bottle of Ontario Riesling. She seemed sweet enough, one of the other women offered, but it sounded more like a question than a statement. Sweet. Sheila's voice was flat. Sweet doesn't pay property taxes. Sweet doesn't know how to dress for a family function. You should have seen what she wore to Easter last year. Marcus said nothing, not a word. Joanna didn't move. She told herself to leave, to walk back around the long way, to pretend she hadn't heard anything. But her feet had turned to concrete and her chest had gone tight and strange. Marcus worked so hard, Sheila continued. He deserves someone who can match him, someone with ambition. That girl quit her accounting job, did I tell you that? Just up and quit. Said she wanted to freelance. What does that even mean? Who does that? Maybe she's doing well with it, said another voice, quieter, less certain. She barely contributes, Sheila said firmly. Marcus is supporting everything, that house, the car, the vacations. And she's at home doing what? Making sourdough bread? I didn't raise my son to be someone's meal ticket. There it was. The thing that cut deepest wasn't the insult. It was the lie, spoken so casually, so completely, to women who would carry it home and repeat it to their own families. Joanna had been freelancing for 11 months. She had just signed her largest contract yet with a mid-size logistics firm in Mississauga. She had paid for the car. She had paid for the last vacation to Prince Edward Island entirely herself, because Marcus had a slow month at the firm, and she hadn't said a single word about it to anyone. She set the canvas bag down on the garden path very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands are shaking. Then she walked home. Marcus was in the kitchen making coffee when she came through the door. He had that easy Saturday morning look about him. Worn flannel shirt, hair not quite combed, reading something on his phone. He looked up and smiled, and for a second, she thought she might actually tell him what she'd heard. But something stopped her, the way he was smiling, the way the morning still felt almost normal. You were quick, he said. Thought you'd be out there for hours. Garden was already busy, she said. Which was true. She put the seedlings on the counter and poured herself a glass of water, and stood there, looking out the kitchen window at the backyard, while Marcus told her something about a hockey game later that afternoon. She made the right noises. She was good at that. 11 years of Catholic school in rural Nova Scotia had taught her how to keep her face entirely calm while everything underneath it was doing something else entirely. What Joanna understood, standing at that kitchen window, was this. Sheila had been saying these things for a long time. This wasn't the first audience. This wasn't a slip of the tongue, or a moment of frustration vented to a close friend. This was a story Sheila had built, polished, and was actively distributing to their community. And everyone in that community believed her. Because Sheila was charming and organized and had lived in this neighborhood for 26 years. Joanna had lived here for 14 months. She drank her water and decided not to say anything. Not yet. In the weeks after that Saturday morning, Joanna started paying closer attention. She had always noticed things. It was part of what made her good at her work, that methodical, almost involuntary habit of cataloging details. But she had never really turned that attention toward Sheila. She had always told herself it was normal mother-in-law friction. She had told herself that Sheila just needed time, that their relationship would warm up eventually, that these things took years sometimes. She stopped telling herself that. She started having coffee with Paula next door, who had known the family for 15 years. She started joining Marcus for his parents' Sunday dinners instead of finding excuses to skip them. She watched, and she listened, and she began to understand the architecture of what Sheila had built. The version of Joanna that existed in Sheila's telling was specific and consistent. In that version, Joanna had convinced Marcus to buy a house he couldn't afford. Joanna had pressured him into quitting his previous job at a larger firm for the boutique practice, where he was now a junior partner. A job Sheila had always quietly disapproved of. Joanna had alienated Marcus from his university friends. Joanna didn't want children, which was why they didn't have any yet. Joanna spent money carelessly. Joanna didn't cook. The remarkable thing about this version was how many small truths it had swallowed and rearranged. They had bought the house together equally. Marcus had been the one to push for the career change, and it had been the right call. He was happier, earning more, building something real. His university friends had drifted away before Joanna ever appeared, the natural entropy of people moving to different cities for different reasons. The children question was something she and Marcus were navigating privately, on their own timeline, and it was nobody else's business. As for the cooking, Joanna made a lamb stew that Marcus had once said was the best thing he'd ever eaten in his life, and she had a binder of her grandmother's Cape Breton recipes that she'd been slowly working her way through since they moved in. None of these facts were known to the women in Sheila's garden circle. Why would they be? They had only ever heard one version of things. It was in late November that Joanna discovered something that changed the shape of everything. She had been helping Marcus organize the home office, a task that had been on their list since summer, when she found a folder tucked behind a stack of old insurance documents. She hadn't been looking for anything. She was just tidying. Inside the folder was a letter from the bank, dated 4 months ago. It was a notice about a line of credit. The line of credit was under Marcus's name, which was normal. Marcus had had that account for years. But the letter was referencing a cosigner on a recent extension of the credit limit. The cosigner was Sheila. Joanna sat down on the office floor and read the letter 3 times. The credit limit had been extended by $40,000. Sheila had cosigned. Marcus had never mentioned any of this. She put the letter back in the folder. She put the folder back behind the insurance documents. She went to the kitchen and made tea, and sat at the table for a very long time. The thing that frightened her wasn't the money itself. People borrowed money. Lines of credit were normal. What frightened her was the picture it painted. Sheila had financial involvement in their household that Joanna had known nothing about. And Marcus had not told her, which meant either Marcus was hiding it from her, or Marcus thought it wasn't a big deal. Or, and this was the version she kept coming back to, Sheila had found a way to make herself financially necessary to her son without Joanna's knowledge. She thought about the garden fence. She thought about the word contributes. She thought, this is why. If Sheila could make Joanna look financially dependent, financially careless, financially irrelevant to her own household, then Sheila became the indispensable one. The one who stepped in, the one whose co-signature mattered, the one Marcus needed. Joanna thought about this very carefully, and then she decided what to do. She didn't confront Marcus, not immediately. She understood that a confrontation, done wrong, would become the next chapter of Sheila's story, the one where Joanna was controlling, paranoid, trying to come between Marcus and his mother. She had seen enough of how this worked to know that timing and approach were everything. Instead, she did what she always did when she needed to understand something fully before acting on it. She gathered information. She had a conversation with her own accountant, framed as a hypothetical question about joint household finances and undisclosed credit arrangements. The answer was clarifying in ways she hadn't expected. She had coffee with Paula next door and let the conversation move toward family dynamics, toward Sheila, toward the neighborhood history. Paula was generous with context in the way that people are when they've kept quiet about something for a long time and finally feel they have permission to speak. Sheila was very involved when Marcus's father was ill, Paula said, turning her mug in her hands. She handled everything. All the finances, the medical decisions, everything. Gordon appreciated it. He wasn't a detail person. I always thought. She paused. I always thought it was hard for Sheila when he recovered and didn't need her to manage things anymore. She's the kind of person who needs to be needed. Joanna nodded slowly. She used to say the same things about Gordon's business partners, Paula continued. That they were taking advantage, that they didn't understand what they had. She's very protective. She paused again, sometimes in ways that aren't quite right. She also quietly and carefully began keeping notes, not accusatory notes, just dates, times, specific things that were said and by whom. The kind of record that was useful if you ever needed to have a calm, clear, factual conversation with someone. And she started showing up differently. At Sunday dinners, she stopped deflecting when Sheila's friends or Gordon's extended family asked what she did for work. She told them specifically, clearly, with the quiet confidence of someone who didn't need to prove anything, but was also done with being misrepresented. She mentioned the Mississauga contract. She mentioned the rate she charged. She mentioned the fact that she had just been referred to a second client by the first, which was how good freelance relationships worked. She watched Sheila's face during these conversations. Sheila smiled through all of it. Sheila was always composed in company, But there was a quality to the smile that Joanna recognized. It was the expression of someone recalibrating. The Christmas season came. Sheila organized a family dinner in mid-December, the kind of occasion that in other years had felt to Joanna like an obligation to endure. This year she looked forward to it with something closer to intention. The dinner was at Sheila and Gordon's house on a Friday evening, and it was larger than Joanna had expected. Beyond Marcus's immediate family, his sister Tara, Tara's husband Kevin, their 2 kids, there were aunts, an uncle, 2 of Gordon's cousins from Guelph, and several of the same neighborhood friends Joanna recognized from the garden circle. The house smelled like pine and butter, and the particular kind of festive effort that Sheila put into every gathering. The kind that made everyone feel warm and well taken care of, and slightly in debt to her. Joanna had brought a chocolate bûche de Noël that she'd spent 2 days making from scratch, using a recipe her grandmother had adapted from a French-Canadian version she'd clipped from a magazine in 1978. She'd also brought a gift for the household, a bottle of 15-year-old Scotch whiskey that she knew Gordon had been wanting. "You didn't have to," Sheila said when Joanna handed both over at the door, and her voice was warm and gracious and entirely without texture. "I wanted to," Joanna said, simply. The evening went the way those evenings go. Drinks and conversation in the living room, then the move to the dining table, then the long, slow rhythm of a family dinner where stories overlap and wine gets refilled, and children get loud and tired. Joanna sat between Gordon and one of the cousins from Guelph, a retired teacher named Frank, who had strong opinions about the Trans-Canada, and asked Joanna good questions about her work. It was during the dessert course, her bûche de Noël, which had gone over well enough that Gordon went back for a second slice, that the conversation at Joanna's end of the table turned, as conversations at family dinners often do, to money and housing prices and the difficulty of the current market. "It's a different world from when we bought," said Frank. "Sheila, what did you and Gordon pay for this place?" 90-something? 94,000, Gordon said, shaking his head slowly. "In 1991. Someone did the math on what it would be worth now, and there were the appropriate sounds of disbelief. "Marcus and Joanna did well with their place," Gordon said. He said it warmly, with genuine pride, and Joanna noticed Sheila's expression from across the table, that recalibrating smile again very briefly. "We did," Joanna agreed. "We were lucky with the timing, and it made sense for us. I'd had a good run of contracts that year, and we were in a position to make a strong offer." It was not a dramatic statement. It was just true, and Joanna said it the way you say something that is simply the reality of your situation. She saw Paula, seated 2 seats down, look at her quietly over the rim of her wineglass. Paula had heard Sheila's version of this story, the one where Marcus had overextended himself, where the house had been Joanna's insistence. Paula was now holding a different version in her hands and understanding something about the distance between the two. "Joanna's been doing really well lately," Marcus said. He said it with the easy, casual pride of a husband, and it landed in the room without drama, without effort. "That new contract is a big one." "It is," Joanna said. She smiled at him across the table. Sheila said nothing. She was busy cutting a neat piece of bûche de Noël and arranging it on her plate. Marcus knew the truth, Joanna had decided, but he hadn't known what his mother was telling people. She understood this now, not because she'd excused it, but because she knew him. He was not the kind of person who would knowingly allow his wife to be misrepresented. He was the kind of person who simply hadn't known it was happening, because he and his mother moved in separate social spheres when they weren't in the same room, and because Sheila was very careful about what she said when Marcus was present. The line of credit was a different matter. That was something they needed to talk about properly. She raised it on a Sunday afternoon 2 weeks after the Christmas dinner, the kind of quiet winter afternoon in January, when the light comes in sideways through the windows, and there's no reason to be anywhere. She made tea and she told him what she'd found, and she asked him to explain it. To his credit, he didn't deflect. He sat with it for a long moment. Then, he said, she offered. "After the furnace replacement last spring, you remember it was terrible timing, we'd just had that roof inspection bill. She said she could help. I thought it was a temporary thing. I should have told you." "You should have told me," Joanna said. She wasn't shouting, she wasn't crying, she was just being clear. "I know, that's our household, Marcus, both of ours. I need to know what's happening in our household." "I know. You're right, I'm sorry." He looked up. "Do you want to pay it off?" "We can pay it off." "Yes," she said. "I want to pay it off, and I want your mother's name off it. And I want to understand why you didn't think this was something I needed to know about." The conversation that followed was harder and longer, and more honest than any conversation they'd had in the last year. It wasn't a fight, exactly. It was more like the careful removal of something that had been sitting in a wall, without either of them noticing until it had started to affect the structure. They talked about Sheila. They talked about what Marcus had grown up understanding as normal. His mother's management, her involvement, her particular way of expressing love through control. They talked about how that had followed them into this house and this marriage without either of them fully naming it. By the end, Marcus looked exhausted but also different. The way people look when they've set something down that they've been carrying so long, they'd forgotten it wasn't part of them. "I'll talk to her," he said. "I know you will," Joanna said. "Take your time. Do it right." She didn't know exactly what Marcus said to his mother. She didn't ask. She understood that there were conversations between a son and his parent that needed to happen without her in the room, and she was at peace with that. What she noticed in the months that followed was a change in the weather. Sheila called Marcus slightly less often. When she did call, the calls were shorter. At the Easter dinner in April, she was quieter than usual. Still gracious, still entirely composed, but quieter. The stories she told were smaller. She didn't hold court the way she had before. At one point during that Easter dinner, Sheila found herself next to Joanna in the kitchen while they were moving dishes to the table. Just the two of them, for a minute, in the way that kitchens sometimes arrange. Sheila picked up the serving bowl of roasted carrots and looked at Joanna in a way that was different from any way she had looked at her before. Not warm, exactly. Not apologetic. Just honest, maybe. More honest than usual. "Marcus is happy," she said, quietly. "I can see that. He is," Joanna said. "We both are." Sheila nodded. She carried the carrots to the table. It was not a reconciliation exactly. It was not the moment where everything was forgiven and the relationship became something new, but it was real. It was a small, specific, true thing, and Joanna had learned by now that those were more valuable than dramatic gestures. Paula called in May to ask if Joanna would be joining the garden committee this season. "I think I will," Joanna said. She arrived on the first Saturday in June, with a flat of tomato seedlings she'd started on the kitchen windowsill in March, and a thermos of coffee she'd made from beans she'd bought at the farmer's market. The other women were already there, setting up their plots, talking about the summer. Sheila was there too. She looked up when Joanna came through the gate. Something passed across her face. Not quite guilt, not quite relief. Something that acknowledged, very briefly, that she knew Joanna had heard her that October morning. Joanna held her gaze for a moment, calm and steady, and then she smiled. Not the performance of a smile, a real one. "Morning," Joanna said to the group. She unzipped her garden bag and got to work. The sun came through the maple trees at the edge of the property the way it does in early June in Ontario, all warmth and light, and the sense that the season has finally, fully arrived. The garden smelled like earth and cedar, and the particular freshness that only comes after a long winter. Joanna pressed her seedlings into the soil one by one, methodically, the way she did everything important. She thought about the October morning and the cedar fence, and the way those words had stopped her cold on the path. She thought about what she had done with that moment. Not what she had said, but what she had built, quietly and carefully and without drama. She thought about Paula, who had seen things more clearly than anyone had asked her to see them. She thought about Marcus, sitting across the table from her in January, finally setting something down. She thought about a chocolate bûche de Noël and a bottle of 15-year-old scotch and a serving bowl of roasted carrots carried quietly from a kitchen to a table. She patted the earth firmly around the last seedling. Not every lesson is taught loudly. The ones that stick, she had come to believe, usually aren't.